consider the phones that we have to get as always being the high-end flagship phones. But what about if I tell you that the mid-range phones are just as good now as the flagship phones? This Samsung A54 is actually a really good phone. Let's get into it. It really depends on what you're looking for in a phone, and I will reiterate this several times in this video, but as a daily driver phone that I spent the last couple weeks with, honestly, for your typical tasks from web browsing to texting to even the occasional gaming and watching streaming videos, the phone works perfect. And no, it's not running on the highest end Snapdragon, and no, it doesn't have the highest end cameras. But these are things that unless you're using those specific features every day, you're not going to miss out on these. And I really think if you are trying to stay in a budget and not just empty out your wallet, $450 or probably even lower for this phone, depending on if you get it on a contract or Amazon has a deal going wherever you get it, you're probably going to get it even lower than $450. So right there alone, the cost should be a major consideration for you. When we go to mid-range phones, we typically decide that the displays won't be as good. And I think that's a thing anymore that is not really an issue. Displays are so good and so easy to make that look great even at a mid-range phone. This is a 6.4-inch screen, so this also helps making the display look just a little bit sharper because it's a smaller screen. You might be one that actually likes the smaller screen. In my opinion, these phones are always easier to hold than your gigantic slabs like the Samsung S23 Ultra. And with that screen, you get a lot of the features that you would on the S23 line. Some minor things cut, but I still don't think they're major issues. So you get a 1080p screen instead of 1440 that you would get on the Ultra. You don't even get 1440p on the S23. So if you're comparing the S23 to the A54, there's something else that's no difference. You still get 120 Hertz on the screen refresh rate. It's not as much of a variable refresh rate down to like 1 Hertz or anything like that, crazy like the S23 or Galaxy line does, but it still offers you that refresh rate and that smooth scaling and smooth scrolling of the content you're looking at. And I think that's really the important thing, is still offering that, because honestly you're probably not going to notice that difference between 60 and 100 Hertz and constantly shifting. It's just having that. And I think it's even more important to have that in a mid-range because it covers some of the limitations of the chipset and maybe the RAM, but with you having that smoother scrolling and just the phone feeling overall smoother, I think it covers up a lot of what the chipset can't do. As far as screen brightness, you do have to have it all the way turned up outside, but it's still, I believe, 1000 nits, and it's plenty capable of seeing outside as well. The build is great. The build is almost identical now to the Galaxy line. If you hold this up to an S23, you'll be hard to tell really the difference of the two, especially how the camera cutouts are. They are very similar in that nature. Now, of course, if you go to the S23 Ultra, you're definitely going to tell a difference. Much bigger phone, has the curved edges, and has more cameras. But this one even supports IP67, which is a drop down from IP68. Still water resistant. I believe it just doesn't have as deep as groove for resistance on the glass. So it's still pretty rugged. Obviously, I would always recommend, with a flat screen like this that can support it, getting a tempered glass screen protector and a case. And one of my favorite cases is Spiegel's. And this is a really thin case. Might be a good one to add. Those accessories will be in the description below. Chipset and RAM. This is what all the flagships do all their advertising on, that makes them really want people to get the highest end, especially on Android. Apple, of course, uses the same chip on most of their devices each year. All those devices go over specific chipsets that they offer. So what this one offers is a chipset from Samsung. We have kind of seen the market or Samsung get away from using their own chips and more to using the standard Snapdragon for the high end. They are still using their own chips in this. There are even ones that are lower in the A line, but this is really the sweet spot in my consideration. The A54 is, you really don't give up much. Beyond the chipset, let's talk about RAM. It's of course another big important piece of a phone because of your multitasking. That's what the RAM is mainly doing, is keeping apps in the background so that you can multitask without opening that app back up and then the app refreshing. The RAM in this phone is 6 gig, which is pretty average for mid-range. 6 to 8 gig is the de facto standard for most mid-ranges. So you get a pretty good amount of phones that you can keep in storage. Benefit that Samsung always offers on their phones, even again on the A54, is a virtual RAM feature where you can actually take some of your memory or your space from your internal drive and use it as virtual memory. This will help you essentially keep more apps in memory. But this is where you start to see some of the limitations because of the chipset and just because of the mid-range capabilities, is in multitasking. So let's say if you did split screen and you had 2 apps open, maybe something running in the background. I have seen a little bit of delay or stuttering in opening apps or it doing something, but they're very, very minimal. I still wish all phones had micro SD, but you know, most phones have eliminated that now, and that's where we are. And lastly, the cameras. We can't leave out the cameras. So this is another area that typically is a shortcoming with mid-rangers, or what they do to reduce from the high ends. And so really the two major things that as the differentiators between mid-range and high-end phones is the processor, Snapdragon versus Exynos, or the cameras. We have 3 cameras. They look very similar as the Galaxy line, but they offer a little bit of different capabilities and are a little bit more limited in what you can do with them. So I have a 50 megapixel main camera. That's still close and comparable to the S23 and takes great photos still. You have a 12 megapixel wide, which is similar as well to the other flagship phones, but you have a 5 megapixel macro. So this is where a lot of manufacturers either cut corners, is either on the wide angle or the macro. A lot anymore is typically on the zoom or macro, is by lowering the cost of that higher priced lens by putting a macro lens in instead. So it's not as fully capable of doing any zooms. It's all digital zoom, but you've got a macro there that still offers a little bit of zoom features. But your main camera is your 50 megapixel, so it really comes down to you on what you're doing with photos. Are you mainly a point and shoot person? Because if you are, and you're not trying to do nighttime photography or moonshots or any of those crazy things, the 50 megapixel main camera is a great camera on this still. It's a sensor that's used in a lot of phones, even the Galaxy line. Some of them use this lens. So you're still getting a great camera that can take great photos during natural lighting or outdoor lighting, daylight, etc. And the wide angle is still a good wide angle too. It's hard to mess up a wide angle anymore as well. But you've heard me talk about all the great things the Samsung A54 can do, but you really haven't heard me complain about anything. Well, just like any phone, any gadget, any electronic, there's got to be something that isn't perfect with it. And that's the case with mid-rangers. Again, you know, it isn't the best chip in it. So your mileage may vary and you may find that the chip is underperforming what your expectations are. Mine, it felt great for normal day-to-day uses and scrolling, But there were two things that I didn't like, and this happens a lot on mid-range phones, and that is the charging speed. It is only capable of charging up to 25 watts. Samsung is even a little bit behind compared to other carriers like OnePlus or like the VOOC charging from OnePlus's parent company now. But it only offers 25 watt charging. Samsung's high-end models support 45 watt charging. It has a 5,000 milliamp battery, so depending on how you use the phone again, that may be very sufficient for you to get through the day. With this being a lower mid-range processor, it's not going to be as hungry on how it runs apps. It doesn't have as much RAM, so it isn't going to try to keep stuff in storage and try to do as much background tasks. So that 5,000 milliamp battery paired with that 25 watt may be perfectly fine for you to plug it in at the end of the day and charge it. The other one is a very common thing that is excluded on mid-range phones. It's another one I really don't honestly understand because the part to put in it is so cheap. It's another one smartphone manufacturer used to exclude higher end phones and show differences, and that is wireless charging. There isn't any wireless charging in it. You can add an accessory, and I have a video showing on how to do that. It's a short that shows you an accessory that you can get to add wireless charging. But by default, it doesn't have wireless charging in it either. That might not be a deal breaker for you. Wireless charging is always slower than wired charging, so it just depends on your preferences again. So I think you have to ask yourself, what do you believe you might be missing in a phone like this? An everyday use phone for scrolling, for social media, for some standard picture taking, to watching streaming videos. This phone is excellent. You're not going to notice any problems. It's got a good battery. It's got a pretty good processor that will get you through the whole day without you missing a lot of those high-end features and saving your wallet a lot of money. So at the end of the day, I think this is probably the best mid-range smartphone out on the market at this point. So let me know your comments or thoughts about this below, and I'll see you in the next video.